Webinar. I'm Mike O'Neill, and say hello to or hear from Rhonda Beard. Rhonda?
Good morning, everybody. This is Rhonda Beard. I'm glad everyone could join us and hope that we're able to help out with some questions that you might be having today.
This is our third webinar. The first webinar was held literally 3 weeks ago, and given the request for more, we have decided to try to set this up kind of as a weekly offering. The goal of this webinar is not for you just to be hearing us talk. The goal is for us to make it as interactive as we possibly can. The way that works is as you have questions, please note those in the Q&A panel, and our goal is to focus primarily on the questions that you are raising this morning. If by chance we don't have an answer for you this morning, as Rhonda mentioned, it may be that some folks on this webinar will have a good answer for you, but irrespective, we're going to get back to you to make sure we've answered your question to the best of our ability. We have blocked 1 hour, and we want to use that time very constructively. For those who are on our first webinar, you know that what we were doing is dealing with the onset of this the crisis. It was coming at us fast, and the things that we explored is all these folks that are asking or now working from home. What can we do as employers to make sure that working from home actually works? We also looked into what does a crisis do to communication? And I think we all would agree in a crisis, communication often suffers. What can we as business owners, as business leaders, HR pros do to see that communication doesn't suffer on an ongoing basis? We also were dealing very early on with this was coming on, and we knew that we had a business that we're trying to run, but how do we do so and maintain productivity, but also maintain a sense of compassion? And with some of the shelter-in-place orders, that's changed. Our suspicion, and I'd like to kind of learn from you, many of you are probably working remotely even this morning, and the employees that you work with are doing the exact same thing. In our first webinar, we did begin getting into the recently signed legislation, whereas we picked up in our second webinar on what probably sounds like a bunch of alphabet soup, be it EIDL, be it PPP. This one's a little bit easier, the CARES Act. But we also recognizing we have some folks on this call who own businesses. And what do you do in a crisis situation to effectively manage through the crisis? Just for the benefit of the folks who are on this webinar, let me just give you a quick sense of the kind of industries that are represented on this call right now. We got a number of you who come out of manufacturing. We have several of you who are in the nonprofit area. We have consultants. We have a number of you who are out of the services sector. We have folks whose full-time role is in marketing. We have folks from government and finance. We have recreation. We have contract staffing, and we have business owners. And with that in mind, we're going to try to keep our answers aligned with those folks that we have on the call. Since last Thursday, when we had this last webinar, I would trust most of you to agree, a lot has changed. A lot has changed literally in the last 24 hours. But if you've been watching news, as of this morning, the cases of coronavirus has topped 400,000. Unemployment is through the roof. In the last 3 weeks, 15 million Americans have signed up for unemployment, and it's believed that's going to climb to about 20 million by the end of this month. Because we're not on the road, many of our auto insurance companies are cutting our premiums, which is, I guess is good, but it's a kind of sign of the new reality we're dealing with right now. OPEC's getting nervous because people aren't buying gas, and so they're slashing production. So hopefully the costs will go up and we'll pay more for what we actually are getting. And what Rhonda will cover in a little more detail here in just a few minutes. The latest word we get is the stimulus checks should begin rolling out as early as, it could be as early as today. That will be kind of interesting to see. Based on the questions that we've already received prior to this webinar, Here are the four categories that we will be looking to try to cover, and we're going to kind of alternate back between Mike and Rhonda. The first being the FFCRA and CARES, and then I'm going to pick up on some small business loan information. And time permitting, we would like to get into some safety and workers' comp issues and protected concerted activity issues that kind of emerge as a result. However, you see in very bold letters down there, we want to focus on your questions. So the more questions we have here, the more meaningful we hope this will be for you. So we're glad you're on this webinar. This is designed for you. This is designed for us to learn from each other. And Rhonda, I'm going to let you cover the very first topic.
Okay, so I think for those, particularly in human resources, you're probably seeing a lot of updates on the FFCRA and CARES Acts. And information is coming out every day. So some of the topics that we seem to be getting a lot of questions about, or people are still uncertain, or there's new information coming out, we wanted to go ahead and cover. So we've covered pretty much the basics, and probably most people are familiar with the basics of both of these. But if you have any questions on either of these or anything that we start talking about that we're not covering, just put it in the Q&A and we'll make sure that we get your questions answered on this webinar today. One that came up was tracking hours for people who are on intermittent leave that may be taking the expanded family leave, for instance. And we talked about this briefly last week, and there's been a little bit more guidance on it, but there's still controversy and not a real clear answer on tracking intermittent leave for exempt employees. But I think one thing to keep in mind, and the guidance that I've gotten when I've questioned, is that it is okay to track hours for exempt employees who are taking intermittent leave, because the hours that they're taking for the expanded family leave are going to be paid at 2/3 of their pay. So it is okay to ask your exempt employees to keep track of what hours they're working and what hours they're not working, if they've applied for intermittent leave and they're working remote where you don't know and they're not in the workplace. So it is okay to do that, pay them full pay for the hours they're working, 2/3 pay for the hours that they're taking intermittent leave. And that could be throughout the day. If you have someone who's at home taking care of their child or helping their child with schoolwork at home, they could be working a couple hours in the morning, not working for 3 or 4 hours in the middle of the day, and then working later in the day. So if you have the flexibility with your salaried people for them to get their full work schedule in, even if it's not during your traditional office hours, it's obviously best to go ahead, if they can work 2 hours in the morning, take a few hours off during the middle of the day, and then work 5 or 6 hours later in the afternoon and get their full day in. If you have some flexibility with hours, try to allow people to do that. But if they truly say, I need time off and I need to take this expanded family leave, then make sure that you are tracking hours and keeping track of what you're paying for that intermittent leave. Leave time for 2 parents. So the questions come up: can both parents take the expanded family leave or the paid sick leave to be home with their children? And, I've talked to some people who they may have 3 or 4 children at home, and they're trying to, administer schoolwork and take care of them while they're trying to work as well. So can both parents take the same time simultaneously as leave to be home with their children? And generally the answer would be no, because the reasons to take time off are because you're needed to care for your child and you're unable to do any work or telework as a result. So as an employer, you could certainly push back and let the employees know that typically only one spouse is needed to provide care at any given time. If they have extenuating circumstances, maybe they do have 6 kids at home and they're trying to do schoolwork all at the same time, or have special needs children, or have specialized care that's normally provided for them that now isn't. So they would need to detail those specific reasons that both parents are needed to be home. But typically you really should only need one parent to be home at a time. Now, they could certainly take time, for instance, one parent might take 6 weeks and then the other parent could take 6 weeks or something to that extent, but simultaneously generally shouldn't need both parents to be home with the children unless there's extenuating circumstances. Another topic, so how about when school's out for the summer? Is the expanded family leave still going to be available? Because I think when this originally rolled out a few weeks ago, a lot of people were thinking school will be back in session in a month. So we weren't thinking along the lines of what happens when this 12 weeks runs into the summer, when a lot of schools typically would be out of session. Can people still take the family leave because their kids are home? And really, that's going to depend on what's happening as far as stay at home and self-quarantine and isolation orders at that time. But typically, I think the initial answer or thought was, well, if school's not in session, then you'd have to find other care for your children in the summer anyway. So you can't take family leave because you're going to need to just use whatever care you would have used in the summer. But that care might not be available. So if that's the case, remember the reason for leave is that if the child care provider is not available because of a COVID-related reason. So we could still have child care centers, or you could still have stay-at-home restrictions that are not allowing people to care for children. So if those restrictions are still in place and someone does not have child care available for their children when school is out, then that expanded family leave could still be taken well into the summer if these restrictions are still in place with child care providers and centers. Documentation, I think there's been quite a bit of information that's come out on documentation required, but that also changed and continues to get more detail every week. And so I'm just going to run through it real quickly. For someone taking the the paid sick leave, they're going to need to provide, the reason they're taking the leave, the name of the employee, the date the leave is requested, the reason that they're taking the leave, and a statement from the employee as to why they're unable to work, and stating which of the 6 qualifying reasons they're taking the leave for. If they're requesting leave because of their own COVID-related illness or symptoms, or a family member's COVID-related illness or symptoms, they also need to provide the healthcare provider's name who has either diagnosed or suggested that they be quarantined or isolated. So a doctor's slip is not required, and the CDC has advised that employers should not be requesting employees to get doctors' excuses, because the doctors are way too busy right now to deal with that documentation. But they do need to list the doctor that they have been treating with, and they have to have been treating with a medical professional that has either diagnosed or advised isolation or quarantine. For the expanded family leave, if someone is taking time off to care for their children whose school or child care provider is unavailable, the name and age of the child being cared for, the name of the school or child care provider that's closed or become unavailable, a statement from the employee that there's no other suitable person available to care for the children. And then something that was recently added too is if the child is older than 14, the presumption is that that child could really take care of themselves if this is during daylight hours. Different if you have someone working night shift with children at home. But if it's a day shift employee, the child is over 14, the employee needs to provide a statement explaining the special circumstances that require them to be home to care for that child over the age of 14. And another question that came up as well is, how long do we need to keep, what do we need to keep in terms of filing for tax credits for these payments, and how long do we need to keep them? So you do need to make sure you have detailed information on people taking sick leave, the amount of time they've taken, how much you have paid them during that time for your tax credits. And tax records are required to be retained for 4 years. So all of this documentation you should also plan to retain for at least 4 years. So if there's any questions about any other details around that, just go ahead and put them in the Q&A pane and we will get those answered.
That being said, we have gotten some questions that have come in already in advance. Let me ask one of those if I can, Rhonda. Let's say you've got an employee who decided to self-quarantine for 2 weeks because they believe they have COVID symptoms, but they didn't seek treatment for that, didn't go see a healthcare provider. Can they be paid for those 2 weeks under the FFCRA?
Well, no, typically they cannot. So in order to take the paid sick leave, you you can't just self-quarantine. You have to have seen a medical professional healthcare provider that has either diagnosed or advised you to self-quarantine. So if an individual decides to stay home because they feel they have symptoms, but they haven't gotten any medical treatment, you could certainly allow that time as unpaid, or you could allow it under other paid time off or time off that you have available as an employer, but it's not going to be eligible for the paid sick leave time.
Okay, thank you. I got one more, and that is, you've mentioned the EFMLA and the EPSLA. Can an employee, this is the question, can that employee choose to take 12 weeks of the EFMLEA, what a mouthful, first, and then take 2 weeks of the EPSLA, my apologies, so the employee will have access to 14 weeks of leave to care for a child due to school closing?
Yes, actually, an employee could expand their leave to 14 weeks. So again, assuming they meet the eligibility criteria, the employee can take those first 2 weeks as unpaid time if they choose to, and then carry out the next 10 weeks of EFMLEA. So that would give them their 12 weeks. And then they could tack on the 2 weeks of the paid sick leave at the end of that. So they could take 14 weeks total if they qualify for the reasons under both of those acts.
I got you. All right. Thank you. I apologize if I stumble over all of these abbreviations. I don't know if you all have the same issue as I do, and I'm sorry if we end up using them. Sometimes the abbreviations save time. Sometimes I get tongue-tied. We're going to move to another set of questions that have come up, and as many of you probably have found, there are loans available administered by the Small Business Administration that we've covered in the past, but I would like to just very briefly just remind those who are on this webinar of what is available. Let's first talk about what the loans are, how does it work, and let's talk about the practical aspects of taking advantage of those. The first one is yet another set of initials, the EIDL, Economic Injury Disaster Loan. This is administered by the Small Business Administration, and just for the benefit of those who are on the call, the SBA views any organization that has 500 employees or less as being small. Now, in my line of work, 500 employees is large, but since we're using their definition, it turns out that the legislation that is now in effect specifies and specifically targets those employers that have 500 employees or less. What's unusual about this particular loan is that it's opened up to both the profit and the nonprofit sector. That's very unusual. And an organization can borrow up to $2 million in working capital. Now, working capital would be examples of accounts payable. It could be payroll support. It could even be used for rent and mortgage and utilities. And this is a piece that people don't realize, but it's important to know, is that in the process of applying for this loan, borrowers can borrow up to $10,000 in advance, and that advance will be forgiven if the monies received is spent on providing paid leave, maintaining payroll, or to pay for those increased costs due to the supply chain disruptions. And those monies can also be used for mortgage and lease payments. This has been modified as recently as the last 24 hours. And as a general rule, I underline and bolded up to this morning, because what we're hearing is that the kind of the rule of thumb that the SBA is using is that advance would be tied back to about the equivalent of $1,000 per employee. So kind of keep that in mind. But what does make this loan attractive is the low interest rate. Small businesses only pay 3.75. Nonprofits even pay less at 2.75. And the terms, up to 30-year terms for these loans. And what's also nice is that the first payment on these loans can actually be deferred. If you've been like me, and I've been listening to a number of webinars, I listened into several on how does one go about applying for those things. And one of the questions that we've been hearing from clients is, what is the SBA looking for when it comes to deciding if they qualify or not? And they really won't answer that question. What we're hearing is the credit score is a factor. It's not the exclusive factor. But what they're really trying to do is to gauge the organization's ability to repay the loan. Bear in mind, this is a loan, and to qualify, you're going to have detailed financial information about your business, assets, liabilities, and the like. So the EIDL is out there. What is probably getting more attention, and I suspect is the questions that many of you have right now, is what is referred to as the Paycheck Protection Program. I'll refer to it as the PPP. Unlike the previous loan, this one is actually administered more locally. Regional and local banks have the authority to issue these loans. Same criterion. They're looking for employers with 500 employees or less. Nonprofit as well as profit organizations are entitled. $349 billion was set aside at 4%. $349 billion pales any other offer like this that's come out. And an employer can borrow up to $10 million. And we can get into details on that, but it's a calculation based on your average payroll. Unlike other programs, this has been opened up to business owners. It's been opened up to the self-employed, and it's been opened up to independent contractors. And they have relaxed standards regarding personal guarantee and or collateral. What the employer has to simply do is certify that the money would be used to retain workers, to maintain payroll, and it can also be used for mortgage and lease payments and utilities. So you're beginning to see there's some similarities between the two. However, what they say is that you can apply for both. And I think those who are so inclined do so. It has the caveat, and that is the monies that are used for one cannot be also used for number two. You can't necessarily double use those monies. You have to kind of keep them separate. And so the accounting advisors that we've talked to say, it's simple. The money, when you get it, goes into a separate bank account, and you can track it that way. You'll notice that there is a very attractive sweetener on this, if that's the right term, and that is this PPP, provided that the loan is used to pay for the things we've mentioned, is that up to 8 weeks of what you would be spending on wages and mortgage interest and rent utilities, if you spend that and you can document that, and that takes place within 8 weeks of origination of that loan, that amount will be forgiven, and the amount will be not treated as taxable income. So I know that's a lot of mouthful, but what I want to point out to you is on our very first webinar, very few people knew about it. Last week, more and more did. By this Thursday, as many of you probably have read, the Small Business Administration has been totally swamped with requests. And therefore, that says that the word is out. People are applying. But Unfortunately, they've been so swamped that the SBA website has crashed repeatedly. And these regional and local banks, if you've reached out to them regarding the PPP, I've talked to several of my banker friends, and that's all they're doing right now, trying to take care of their customers. But they are therefore not taking on new customers right now. They're trying to take care of their own and walk them through. The reason why I want to just take a few minutes and just give you the highlights of both of these loans is that this is a very attractive alternative for small businesses, which accounts for most of the people who are on this call. It is going to require paperwork. You've got to jump through some hoops, but if you're willing to do so, I learned of a church just last night that qualified, and that church, because it's nonprofit, is going to receive $300,000 to help cover expenses for staff that can't work right now. So I know it is working because they're already giving green lights as recently as yesterday. So hope that gives you a little bit of sense of that. Rhonda, can we go back to some of the things that have come up since we've been talking? One of the questions we have from an attendee, it reads, I know in normal situations there are certain questions that you aren't allowed to ask your employees because it's discriminating. Is COVID concerns superseding that? And this person writes, my understanding was that you're not normally supposed to ask questions about if they are married or have family, for example. So I hope that question makes sense. Do you want to make a stab at that one?
Sure. And I think there's a distinction here. When you're, for instance, interviewing, you're very restricted in asking personal questions to people. But once they're hired, you can certainly ask employees questions about their family, about, in most times, for instance, with new hire paperwork or benefit enrollment, you are asking them for information about spouse and children. So you can definitely ask questions of your employees about their family situation. One thing you do need to be careful about is asking employees questions about their medical details. For instance, you couldn't ask an employee, you couldn't say, hey, I heard that you have a compromised immune system. I heard that, you were treated for cancer last year. So you can't ask them questions about their medical situation that could lead you to make decisions about them being at the workplace around this whole COVID thing because you think that they may have symptoms or you think that they could be high risk. So you can ask questions about their family situation in terms of qualifying them for the expanded family leave, but be very careful asking any medical related questions that could lead you to some conclusions incorrectly about an employee's medical situation.
All right, good. And we've seen this question from Tim. It's a good question, Tim, and it reads, are there any companies out here on this call or that we're aware of that are planning to introduce antibody testing within their workforce?
And Mike, I'll have to say, and Tim, I haven't heard much about that. I've done a little bit of research on it, and there's not a lot being done yet in the US. I think in other countries they've started doing that, but there's also some question about how accurate those tests may be. There's a lot of press around it potentially being a very good measure of someone's ability to work or to be immune from the disease, but I've not heard yet about companies requiring that or using that to determine whether people are available and able to work. So not too much new on that, but that's something we'll definitely follow and provide some updates on possibly on next week's webinar if we can find out more. So that's a really good question, Tim.
We got another one that it's along the same lines, and that is, should we have increased concern about discrimination lawsuits, particularly when you have both parents work for your organization, if you were to grant one parent leave and not the other to care for kids?
So if you have both parents working, again, I think that's something those parents have to work out. And when you relate to them that only one parent can take leave at a time, certainly you want to have some conversations and be very open in communication and flexibility with people as much as you possibly can. But I think that's going to be up to those parents to work out who needs to be home with those children. Or again, if they want to alternate their time, or one take a block of time and then the other take a block of time, if they feel they both need to be out, they need to provide you some very compelling reasons as to why they both need to be away at the same time. But you typically are not going to be required to grant leave to both parents at the same time unless there's some very strong compelling reasons. So I would say just, have very open communication with them and let them know if they are needed at work, how much they're needed, why they're needed, and see what you can work out in terms of an arrangement between them in order to have that work out with their situation. In terms of other discrimination type lawsuits, stresses are high right now. Employees are obviously mostly looking out for their own personal situation, and if they feel like they're not getting what they need or what they want, they could definitely become a little upset and possibly disconcerted with their employer. So the best thing you really can do is just, again, continue to communicate, let people know that, we're all in uncharted waters right now. We're all figuring this out together, and be as flexible as you can with your employees. And if you do have situations that you're concerned about employees being upset or feel that they're being mistreated or being discriminated against, make sure you get some help and support on that, whether it's, through legal counsel. Mike and I can certainly try to help you through situations as much as we can. We're not lawyers, but we have a lot of HR experience in dealing with discrimination type issues, not necessarily COVID, as nobody has, but we'll certainly try to help you through those if you want to get in touch with us, because every situation you come up against is going to be different. So just really encourage you to be open, flexible, and hear every employee out to see what their situation is, but definitely you still need to make sure that you're complying with normal employment laws.
Thank you. We've got another question that happens to be dealing with a safety and workers' comp matter, and we'll come to that here in just a moment. I need to ask you all a favor. We're doing the talking and we're reading your questions. Do me a favor. Would each of you go to the Q&A and answer this question? Would you prefer that this would be kind of an open mic approach, meaning that you could ask the questions live versus having to type? Our goal is to get as many quality questions as possible. Some people are a little bit turned off by writing. So if you would do us a favor, go to the Q&A and answer, yes, you would like an open mic option where people could just speak at freedom and not have to wait to type it in, or not. So we're looking for a yes or no on open mic for our next webinar. Again, our goal is to make this as meaningful as possible. So let's hear from you. Yes, open mic, that is, we hear from you, or no. Some of you are actually typing your response. Okay, good.
And Mike, before we get to the safety related question, there are a couple questions on the payroll protection program and the EIDL. If you could maybe give a little bit more detail on a couple of things that have come in. So can payments to independent contractors or sole proprietors be used in the company's payroll costs? So if you have contractors that you're paying, is that something that can be used in the payments that you're getting through the payroll protection program?
The short answer to that is no. It's supposed to be more pure payroll cost, but what they're saying is that these same individuals, individual contractors and sole proprietors, they themselves can apply directly, but you cannot include those earnings in your payroll cost.
Okay, so what all can the PPP loans be used for specifically?
Well, I want to go back and just kind of look at how we kind of listed that, and what I hope I'm saying to y'all, kind of, it makes sense. The short answer to that is that it can be used for payroll, and what they're really trying to do with this is they're trying to keep people employed. They're really trying to encourage the employers to keep these folks on, even through this hardship, and keep them employed. So the loan can be used to help pay for employees. That means that they are still on board. You can also use those payments to help pay for mortgage and lease payments. And this is a little bit unusual, but you can also use those monies to pay utilities. This is all considered kind of the kinds of things that costs of doing business. It's costs of keeping people employed.
Okay. And I think those are just a lot of questions people have. This stuff has come out so fast, and trying to weed through all the details can be really difficult sometimes.
Gotcha. So Rhonda, why don't we move on to, since we've already have some questions on the safety area.
Okay, sure. So first of all, there's not a lot of guidance in OSHA. If you go to OSHA regulations, they are not giving a whole lot of guidance on COVID-specific workplace issues right now. They are referring back to the CDC and just advising people to follow CDC's requirements for prevention, which, you know, as everybody knows, I'm sure everybody's pretty well aware of wash your hands, social distancing, making sure you're providing detailed information to employees on what's required in the workplace, and standard hazard recognition under OSHA really just basically says that if you have employees that are in close contact, such as healthcare workers, airline employees, grocery store, people that are required to work right now, and they are in close contact with individuals, to again follow the CDC guidelines for social distancing and personal protective equipment, which we'll talk about in a minute. A couple other things to keep in mind for hazard or exposure recognition. If, as an employer, you're doing, you know, extensive cleaning, disinfecting beyond what you normally do, one thing to keep in mind is to make sure that employees know, or that you're aware of, what chemicals are being used for cleaning. Make sure that people, if you have employees doing that cleaning, they're using proper PPE when dealing with those chemicals, and know what the exposure limits and the air quality might be with those chemicals, and know if there's, for instance, if you're using bleach or some other types of agents that have long-lasting air quality effects, you may need to have employees out of work for a period of time so they don't have that exposure risk. So as far as OSHA, you know, they're not giving a lot of guidance on COVID-specific issues other than follow CDC, standard hazard and exposure recognition. Now, as far as masks, and that is something that we had wanted to talk about, and we have a question. If we have employees that are deemed essential, are we required to provide the cloth masks that CDC recommends? Are employees required to provide them? Are there any requirements for materials that they should be made from? So as far as masks, right now the CDC is recommending the cloth masks in public settings. They're not requiring them, but really masks, as they outline it, are intended to be worn by people that either have COVID or have symptoms to prevent them spreading it from others, spreading it to others. There's nothing definite in OSHA that cloth masks are considered PPE in the workplace. But keep in mind that if you are requiring them, first of all, then you should be paying for them. If you're not requiring them and employees choose to use them, you know, you can allow them to use masks voluntarily, but you don't have to pay or reimburse for them if you're not requiring it as part of the job. But before you can require an employee to use a mask or consider it part of your PPE, typically, just with any other PPE, you really need to perform training with employees on how to properly use it and care for it, how to clean it, how to identify, you know, proper PPE for the employees based on the jobs that they're doing, and perform a hazard assessment on what the pros and cons are of using that. So there are some guidelines in OSHA for use of PPE. So if you're going to require use of masks, then you should go to OSHA and look at the PPE requirements and perform that type of analysis to determine whether this is something that you should require in your workplace or not, because you do want to make sure you're following OSHA guidelines if you're requiring it as part of their job. And then workers' comp, real quick, we've had a question about workers' comp claims, and if someone believes that they've contracted COVID at work, can it be a workers' comp claim? Um, Typically only if it has been contracted in the course of their specific occupation, such as a healthcare worker, or again, an airline employee who contracts it because of the requirement of them being close to their customers, close proximity in their workplace, and you cannot change that, for instance, in an airplane. But typically, communicable or contagious diseases are usually excluded from workers' comp policies as being covered. So most likely, in most employers, COVID is not going to be a covered workers' comp claim.
We've had a lot more questions come in. First of all, let me thank you. A number of you responded to my question to you, and that is, would you prefer an open mic? And it would appear most of you who did respond said, no, you find that distracting, and we want to respect your wishes, but also know that if in any way this is a barrier, we want to hear from you. And I'll go ahead and say this now, and I'll repeat that, and that is, the whole purpose of doing this is for us to come together in community to share and learn from each other. One of your questions was raised, and that is, can we kind of put together a summary of what's happened on this webinar? And the answer is yes. Everyone who is registered for this summary will get a packet, and in that packet would include a link to the actual webinar itself. It will include a link to the PowerPoints that we're showing. It will include a list of the questions that have been raised and hopefully responses to those questions, perhaps even those questions that we did not get a chance to get to in the time we set aside this morning. Because this is the third time we will be sending out a follow-up packet, we have learned of some very valuable resources that people have said, boy, this is really great. We will include that in the packet as well. So that will be going out following this webinar. I suspect it would probably be going out tomorrow, so be looking in your inbox for that. Rhonda, one of the questions we have is, how do we pay employees who have applied for short-term disability? Do they still get this emergency paid sick leave?
Well, that could depend on when they applied for short-term disability and the reason that they applied for it. So if they've applied for short-term disability for COVID-related reasons, they could be eligible potentially for partial short-term disability and still get their emergency paid sick leave, because the emergency paid sick leave would only be for the first 2 weeks. So if, for instance, someone is out for their own illness, and I think the best way to handle that would be, the first 2 weeks, they could be eligible for their full pay for the EPSL. So pay them their full pay for the first 2 weeks, and then they've used that up. Then they could go on short-term disability following that, if it is for a COVID-related reason. So, obviously, if someone's on short-term disability for something that's not COVID-related, they're not going to be eligible for the emergency paid sick leave. So I would say they probably cannot get them simultaneously, but could use the 2 weeks first, and then their short-term disability would pay after that.
Good. These are good questions. Y'all keep those coming. One of the questions we got is, should we be making decisions and publishing company guidelines regarding all these questions, like one spouse out at a time, and distributing those to employees as soon as possible? That question kind of goes back to one of the things that we covered in our very first webinar, and that is, what approach to communication should one take in this time? And it varies by organization, but one of the things that we shared is that our employees who we're responsible for, they expect and need information, and they need it on a regular basis. And so our encouragement is, do what you can to provide that information. For those operations that are still up and running, you could literally post that information. You may send it out via email. Our friends at Sparkative are on this webinar, and they have introduced us to Slack as a way to stay informed in real time. So there are lots of ways to do so, but in short, what we're encouraging all employers to do is keep information coming on a regular basis. Often is not often enough, but also when you have information that you need to share, you don't necessarily have to have all the answers before you share it. And share with what you know. So the question really is what should you do here? If you feel it's important that everybody hear that, our encouragement to you is if you got a means to share that, let us encourage you to do so. Just opening up communication channels right now is powerful. We, without exception, are in uncharted territory. Nobody's been through something like this, but we all probably have personally experienced some anxiety about this because looking at the makeup of the people on this call, you guys are leaders. You're decision makers. You're used to getting things done and you need to act. And right now we're being asked to act on information that we just don't really know. So to the best of our ability, what we hope we've done with this webinar series is own up. We don't have all the answers, but I can assure you, Rhonda and I are spending hours every day compiling information, sharing that with clients, learning from each other, and we hope that a portion of that is coming across in these webinars. All right, good question. Thank you very much.
And Mike, there's
Yeah.
Ashley's just made a comment that I'll mention real quickly. From a marketing standpoint, I would think that employers should consider providing cloth masks if at all possible. For example, if you run a grocery store and shoppers see your staff wearing them, they'll feel more comfortable, which I absolutely agree with. I'll have to say the last time I went to the grocery store a week or so ago, I was surprised to find cashiers not wearing masks. And you're right, I would have felt more comfortable as a shopper. So again, keep in mind though, there's a difference between providing them and requiring them. So providing masks to people in your workplace and offering them the availability of those is absolutely something everybody can do, should do. If you're going to require them, again, make sure you go back to the OSHA guidelines and follow the guidelines for PPE if you're going to require that. And then someone also asked about what type of material is best and what types of masks should be provided. So there's a lot of different opinions on that, but we'll send out some follow-up information on what's recommended in terms of what type of masks are the best protection, because there's a lot of different ones out there right now, and some of them you can't get. People are making them, and so there's a wide variety. You want to make sure you're providing the best ones for your employees, so we'll get that out.
Good. You know, another question we have here is, do you offer any support drafting guidelines for us to share with employees? And the answer is we would be happy to do so. Rhonda and I both come from an HR background. We both have worked in HR in different sized organizations, from small family-owned businesses to Fortune 500. And therefore, we're strong advocates of professional associations, particularly the Society for Human Resource Management. But what I would like to remind you is, as a person who is registered for this webinar, one of the things we wanted to do is make this experience most meaningful for people who are going to give us an hour of their time. But we're acknowledging there are also issues that you may be dealing with that you might not want to share publicly, even anonymously via this Q&A panel. For that reason, what I would like to point out to you is we have made available, quite frankly, ourselves. I'm going to just kind of share this with you so I don't forget to do so. And that is, any person who has signed up for these webinars, you're going to get in the packet that we're going to be emailing out a link. If you would like one-on-one time with Rhonda or me, and you would like to ask the kind of questions that might be maybe too detailed for what's on this webinar, let us know. And what we're committing to do is we're going to block up to 2 hours to work with you and try to help you with whatever issues you have. And we put this in writing, but I hope it's understood. This is not an attempt on our part to pitch you on our services. This is our attempt to be able to help others who are dealing with similar issues. And we've had a number of participants take us up on that. And it's really been enjoyable to get to know these participants on a deeper level. So if that's something that would be of interest to you, let us know and we'll get that on the calendar. So thanks. Rhonda, have you seen other questions that come up that we want to make sure we cover? We have a little less than 5 minutes left and we are going to end on time.
Yeah, there's several. Let me just go back to a couple on the loans, Mike, which I think a lot of people do have questions about. You did have, we did have one thing on the slide about employees who make more than 100,000 per year. So there is a restriction on being able to provide loans for payroll of employees over 100,000. So can you talk a little bit about that and what's included for those higher paid employees?
Yeah, I'll be happy to. And I hope this is not going to sound too complicated, but what they're looking for is average payroll cost. And that is they're looking at the aggregate of payroll. But when you have individuals who earn greater than 100,000, you are only able to put the first 100,000 of their salary into the numerator, if you will. And so it's designed to kind of even things out. So those employees who earn greater than 100,000, their salaries up to 100,000 can be included in the pool, but any salary above 100,000 has to be excluded from that calculation.
Okay, good. And then just one comment I wanted to make that I think I actually missed on one of the slides about unemployment. There's been a lot of questions about the unemployment benefits, and of course there's new unemployment benefits available. Keep in mind, if employees are applying for unemployment, it's taking a while to get responses right now because the states are so overloaded with claims. So in Tennessee, for instance, where I'm at, I listened to a webinar yesterday that said it's taking on average 21 days to process claims and get a response out. So if you're hearing anything from employees that might be out or filing for unemployment, it is taking a while. The $600 supplement, got a little clarification on that as well. You first need to qualify for unemployment through your state. So if you qualify, whether it's full unemployment or partial unemployment, if you qualify for any unemployment benefits at all through your state, then the employee is going to also be eligible for the $600 supplement for the 4-month period. And you don't need to apply for that separately. That's going to be included in the normal state unemployment application. So again, other questions on that, just let us know and we can provide more details, but there's updates on unemployment benefits just about every day.
So you're learning that Rhonda is speaking to you from Tennessee. I'm speaking to you from Georgia. And in Georgia, their unemployment offices have been also swamped to the point that they have said, if you are an independent contractor, if you're a business owner, you cannot yet apply for unemployment. Doesn't mean you're not going to qualify, you simply can't apply yet. And so what we're seeing left and right is our government agencies have been just overrun with requests. What we're also seeing is those requests for the loans that we talked about earlier, $345 billion, actually $349 billion. That's a lot of money, but it's already speculated that they've already pretty much have burned through that. And the latest I see is there's yet another round of stimulus being contemplated, specifically targeting small businesses. What I saw last night or this morning is what's being floated is another $250 billion add-on to this loan program. So that gives you some indication of the demand. It also gives you some indication is that our elected officials are hearing loud and clear that our small businesses need this. They must have this to survive, and they're trying to respond in kind. So I know we've covered a great deal of information on this webinar this morning. Our commitment is to finish on time, but the questions you asked were rich. and meaningful. I hope you found that we were able to answer them. Be looking in your email for a follow-up packet, and in that packet will have answers to the questions that have been raised. It will include links to this webinar and PowerPoint, and we'll probably, if you're interested, include a link to the next webinar. We've been holding these weekly because we've been getting requests to do so. So if you want to go ahead and pencil in all likelihood, next Thursday at 10 o'clock, that seems to be a good time for most, we'll probably make one available. What we will talk about will be determined by you. The questions that you have been asking, the questions you continue to ask, that will drive the agenda for our next webinar. So on behalf of Rhonda and myself, thank you so much for giving us an hour of your time this morning. We hope it's been meaningful, and let me encourage you, stay safe and stay strong.